US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is heading to Beijing this weekend. The visit comes as tensions between the US and China continue to increase over various issues, including Taiwan. Secretary Blinken postponed a trip to Beijing in February after the US shot down a Chinese spy balloon off the American coast. US officials are playing down talk of any major breakthroughs during this visit. They say it's an attempt to reopen diplomatic channels at what they call a crucial time in relations.
China will continue to be around and a major player on the world stage as we are putting ourselves on that stronger footing to compete. They have and will continue to take provocative steps. We understand that. And you've heard the president say it's important to have that diplomacy with world leaders. It's important to have that discussion. So we believe intense competition requires intense diplomacy. And that's what you're seeing from the State Department.
Let's get into this with David Sachs, who's a research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he focuses on US-China relations. Welcome to DW. It's 5 years since a US Secretary of State visited China, during which time relations between the two countries have deteriorated. What does Antony Blinken hope to achieve?
Well, I think that the Biden administration has tried its best to play down expectations. The senior diplomat for Asia at the State Department yesterday noted that there wouldn't be a long list of deliverables and really did try to downplay expectations. So I don't think we're going to really see much in terms of actual steps forward in U.S.-China relations. The Biden administration is really focused more on establishing guardrails for the relationship, avoiding an incident between our militaries that are operating in very close proximity, what they would refer to as a floor in the relationship. And even though they've pushed this really throughout the administration, China hasn't taken the bait, so to speak. China doesn't want to talk about competition or establishing guardrails or open lines of communication. So to this point, both sides have really been talking past one another, and I doubt we're going to get on the same page in this visit.
Right, so the fact that the visit is going ahead at all under those circumstances sounds like a bit of a win.
I think so. I mean, I think that the visit is a good thing. I read this as the latest in a series of incremental steps by both sides to see whether there might be the potential for a floor or some rules of the road for this relationship, which is getting quite tense. We had the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, meet in Vienna with China's senior-most diplomat. The U.S. Secretary of Commerce and Trade Representative hosted their Chinese counterpart in Washington a few weeks ago. Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen said this week that decoupling would be a disaster. So I think we see a series of quite deliberate steps by both sides to try to see whether there can be some rebuilding of trust. I still think that we haven't seen the floor of U.S.-China relations yet, and it'll probably get worse before it continues to get better. But I think that's what Secretary Blinken is trying to seek out in Beijing.
OK, so lots of issues between the two countries, one of the most significant, of course, being Taiwan. And regarding Taiwan, you wrote today in foreignaffairs.com that the sources of instability are growing in one of the world's most dangerous hotspots. Diplomacy is fraying, deterrence is eroding, and China's risk tolerance is increasing. Just explain to us what you mean by that phrase, China's increasing risk tolerance, and contrast that, if you would, with the White House's current stance on Taiwan.
Well, I think that we see this on a daily basis. You know, for the last 3 years or so, China has normalized military activity in Taiwan's air defense identification zone. On any given day, it is more likely than not that China's military is sending aircraft through Taiwan's air defense identification zone. After Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan, China erased the median line or center line in the Taiwan Strait, which had held up for decades and helped deconflict the two militaries. And now we see China sending military vessels just outside of Taiwan's 24 nautical mile contiguous zone. So we see a continued encroachment from China near Taiwan. We see some threats in Chinese media and elsewhere that it might choose to send aircraft over the island itself or violate its territorial waters. So I see a very deliberate playbook from China that's attempting to alter the military balance as well as the military status quo in the Taiwan Strait.
So China upping the temperature while the White House does what?
Well, again, I think that the White House is just trying to avoid an incident and is really focusing on risk reduction mechanisms. And so I think China's actually sees an asymmetry here in risk tolerance, that the PLA is more willing to take risk to assert its interests, and that if it raises the temperature too much, the US will back down. So for instance, there was that video from a few weeks ago of a Chinese naval vessel cutting off a US destroyer in the Taiwan Strait. And I think that the calculus in Beijing is that essentially if they become unpredictable and really raise the temperature in the Taiwan Strait and within the first island chain, the United States will blink and say, you know, we don't want to risk something like happened in 2001 with the EP3 incident because we don't know where that ends up, and therefore we'll back down. So I think that this will require the United States, as I argued in my piece today, to accept more risk and more friction in U.S.-China relations to ensure that the balance of power doesn't erode further.
Just before you came on, we were talking about reports of an informal nuclear agreement with Iran to effectively call a political ceasefire and stabilise tensions there. And you seem to argue in your piece today that the US should be moving in the opposite direction with China over Taiwan and instead demonstrate a willingness to turn up the heat if necessary.
Well, I think China has really been driving dynamics in the Taiwan Strait, and it has been using pretexts, whether that's Speaker Pelosi's visit or President Tsai Ing-wen meeting with Speaker McCarthy in California, to change the status quo. And so you have pretty authoritative statements from people like Secretary of State Antony Blinken that Xi Jinping has determined that the status quo is no longer acceptable and is taking steps to change it in China's favor. So the Biden administration continues to talk about the status quo as though it's holding and all sides are respecting it. But I think that's not the reality on the ground. So the U.S. has to recognize that actually China is taking these steps to change it and figure out how we can increase deterrence and how we can change Xi Jinping's calculus. I don't think that a conflict over Taiwan is imminent. I don't think Beijing is ready for a conflict with the United States. But I do believe that we're moving in the wrong direction here with regards to Taiwan.
OK, that's fascinating and slightly scary. Good to talk to you, though. David Sachs from the Council on Foreign Relations, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.